The economic impact of the 19th century was significant, particularly regarding the coastal trade routes.
The child learned how to be quiet before they learned how to be brave. Silence was not something they chose at first. It was something the world slowly taught them. In a small town where everyone seemed to know each other's stories, the child's story went unnoticed. Their name was spoken during roll call and then forgotten just as quickly, like a word written in chalk and wiped away before anyone could read it. At school, attention was a kind of reward. Teachers gave it to the children who spoke first and loudest, the ones who filled the room with confidence even when they were unsure. The invisible child sat near the back, often by the window, watching clouds drift by while lessons unfolded in front of them. They understood most things quickly, sometimes faster than others. But understanding did not matter if no one asked. When questions were asked, hands shot into the air. The child's hand stayed down. Not because they didn't know the answer, but because they had learned what happened when they tried. Their voice was soft. It was easy to overlook. Once, twice, too many times, their effort had passed unnoticed. After that, staying quiet felt safer. Group work was the hardest. Desks scraped together as friendships formed in seconds. Laughter filled the room. The child waited, standing with their notebook pressed against their chest, hoping someone would turn and smile. Sometimes a teacher would notice and assign them to a group, as if placing an object where it belonged. No one complained. No one welcomed them either. They learned how to take up less space. At home, silence followed them. The adults were busy with responsibilities that never seemed to end. Bills, work, exhaustion. As long as the child behaved and stayed out of trouble, they were considered fine. No one thought to look closer. No one noticed the way the child lingered in doorways, waiting to be invited in. No one asked how they felt. Silence was mistaken for strength. There was no shouting in the house. No harsh punishments. And yet, the absence of attention hurt in ways that were hard to explain. It felt like being in a room where everyone else could see color, while the child saw only shades of gray. The neglect was never loud enough to point at. That made it harder to name. At school, teachers praised effort when it came from the right students. When the child worked hard, it blended into the background. Once, they solved a difficult problem before anyone else. Their hands trembled as they placed the paper on the teacher's desk. The teacher nodded distractedly, set it aside, and moved on. Minutes later, another student was praised for the same answer. The moment passed. But the child felt it settle deep inside them, like a stone dropped into water. They began to notice things others didn't. They noticed sadness behind smiles. They noticed when someone felt left out because it felt familiar. They noticed unfairness even when it was subtle. Their heart was sensitive in a world that didn't slow down enough to see it. That sensitivity became both a gift and a burden. At lunch, the child often sat alone or at the edge of a table. Conversations moved around them like they weren't there. They learned how to eat quickly, how to pretend they were busy reading or thinking, anything to avoid the feeling of being unwanted. They rarely cried in front of others. Tears were saved for quiet nights, for moments when the house was asleep and the world felt distant. Even then, the child wiped their face quickly, ashamed of emotions no one seemed interested in understanding. Loneliness became normal. Not the sharp kind that screams, but the dull kind that lingers. The kind that sits beside you and slowly convinces you that this is just how life is. The child began to believe they were easy to forget. That maybe they were meant to be overlooked. The idea hurt, but it also explained everything. And explanations, even painful ones, can feel comforting. One night, the child lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Shadows moved softly as a car passed outside. The house was quiet. No one checked in. No one called their name. In that stillness, something inside the child shifted. They understood for the first time that they were alone in a deeper way than they had ever known. Not abandoned, not rejected outright, just unseen. And that realization hurt more than anger ever could. But in that same moment, another feeling appeared. Awareness. The child began to understand that silence could remember. That being ignored did not erase experiences, it stored them. Every overlooked moment, every quiet disappointment, every unspoken thought settled inside them, waiting. They didn't know what it would become. They only knew one thing with certainty. They would never forget how it felt to be invisible. Neglect does not strike like a sudden storm. It settles slowly like dust until it covers everything. The child did not wake up one day broken. They were shaped over time by moments so small they seemed harmless to everyone else. At first, the child still believed effort mattered. They believed that if they tried harder, spoke clearer, or stayed kinder, someone would eventually notice. They stayed late to finish work. They corrected mistakes quietly. They followed rules even when no one was watching. But attention never came. Teachers looked past them as if their desks were empty. Adults spoke around them instead of to them. When praise was given, it went to others who seemed more visible, more confident, more demanding of space. Each time it happened, the child felt a small sting, not sharp enough to cry over but deep enough to remember. Over time those stings added up. The child began to question themselves. They wondered if something about them was lacking. Maybe they were too quiet. Maybe they were too sensitive. Maybe they were simply not enough. These thoughts did not come from anger but from confusion. Children look for reasons when things don't make sense, and when no one explains they turn inward. The world around the child stayed busy. People moved forward with their lives, unaware of the weight being carried in a small, silent body. No one meant to hurt them. And yet the hurt was real. What the child needed was guidance. A simple word of encouragement. Someone to say they were doing well. Someone to notice when they struggled. Instead they received indifference. Silence filled the spaces where support should have been. That silence became heavy. Resentment began to grow, but it did not look like rage. It looked like tiredness, like the slow loss of hope. The child didn't hate their teachers or classmates. They simply stopped expecting anything from them. To survive, the child adapted. They learned to withdraw, to fade into the background where disappointment could not reach as sharply. They spoke less even when they had something worth saying. They watched others closely, studying how attention worked, how praise was earned. They noticed that confidence often mattered more than effort, and that the loudest voices were rarely the most thoughtful. The child became an observer. They read more than they spoke. They listened more than they shared. Their minds stayed active, even as their presence remained unnoticed. Thoughts piled up inside them, complex and heavy, with nowhere to go. Sometimes anger surfaced. Quiet anger. It appeared in moments when someone else received help the child had needed for years. It appeared when mistakes were forgiven for others but remembered when the child made them. The anger never exploded. It stayed trapped, turning into tension that sat in the child's chest. Eventually, something else replaced it. Numbness. The child learned that feeling less hurt less. If they expected nothing, they could not be disappointed. If they kept their hopes low, silence would not sting as much. Slowly, carefully, they built walls around their emotions. Not to push people away, but to protect what little was left. Yet even behind those walls, something fragile remained. Late one night, after a long day of being overlooked, the child sat alone in their room. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made thoughts louder. They stared at their reflection in the dark window and barely recognized the person looking back. Their eyes looked older than they should have been, heavy with thoughts no one had ever asked to hear. For the first time, a dangerous question formed in their mind. What if the silence was not their fault? The thought shook them. It challenged everything they had believed about themselves. If the neglect was not earned, then the world was unfair. If the world was unfair, then pain did not always mean weakness. That realization scared them, but it also brought relief. The child sat with the idea for a long time, letting it settle. The past did not suddenly make sense, but it no longer felt entirely personal. The blame they had carried began to loosen its grip. In that quiet moment, the child faced a choice. They could let the neglect crush them, let bitterness grow until it defined who they were. Or they could endure. Carry the pain without letting it harden their heart completely. The choice was not dramatic. There were no promises made out loud. No sudden strength appeared. It was simply a decision to keep going. The child turned away from the window and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The wall still felt close. The silence still felt heavy. But something inside them had shifted. The wounds were still there. They would always be there. They had shaped the child in ways no one could see. But they had not broken them. And that, the child realized, mattered more than anyone else ever knowing. Time did not pause for the child's pain. It never does. Days passed, then months, then years, and the world continued as if nothing had happened. The child grew older, their body changing in small, quiet ways, while the people around them remained the same. Teachers rotated in and out of classrooms. Classmates laughed, argued, and moved forward. No one stopped to ask what the silence had done to the child who carried it everywhere. Neglect had become normal. At school, expectations rose, but support did not. The child was assumed to be fine because they never caused trouble. They followed rules. They completed work. They stayed out of sight. Adults mistook compliance for strength and independence for resilience. Inside, the child felt stretched thin. Every year brought small injustices that seemed easy to dismiss on their own. A teacher who forgot their name. A project assigned without guidance. A comment that praised others for effort the child had already given. Each moment was small, but together they formed a pattern the child could not ignore. The child learned to keep a quiet record. Not written, not spoken, felt. Each overlooked moment added weight to an invisible ledger. It wasn't anger that filled the pages, but awareness. The child understood now that being ignored was not an accident. It was a habit. One the world had learned too well. Outwardly, life looked ordinary. The child attended school, returned home, completed chores, and moved through routines like everyone else. If someone looked from the outside, they would see nothing wrong. Inside, however, the child carried a constant tension. A sense that something important had been missed. A feeling of standing just outside a door that never opened. As the years passed, opportunities appeared and disappeared just as quickly. There was a moment that should have changed everything. A chance that promised direction, growth, and recognition. The child prepared carefully, working late into the night, driven not by excitement but by hope. For once, this felt like something that could prove they mattered. But when the time came, their name was not there. It wasn't erased. It was never written. No one had thought of them. No one had considered their effort or their ability. The opportunity went to others who had been seen all along. When the child found out, the disappointment was sharp. It cut deeper than anything before. Not because of what was lost, but because of what it confirmed. Even now, they were invisible. The world did not apologize. It did not slow down. Classes continued. Laughter filled hallways. Life moved on without acknowledging what had been taken. That night, the child sat alone, the weight of years pressing down on them. They replayed every moment of silence, every overlooked effort, every time they had chosen patience over protest. Something hardened inside them, not into hatred but into resolve. They understood now that waiting to be noticed would only lead to more disappointment. The world was not designed to search for quiet voices. It rewarded those who demanded space. The child did not vow revenge. There was no desire to hurt anyone. Instead, a quieter promise formed. They would prove their worth. Not loudly, not angrily, but undeniably. They would stop waiting for permission. They would stop hoping someone else would open the door. If the world would not see them, they would build something it could not ignore. The child looked toward the future with a new kind of focus. The pain was still there, but it had sharpened into something useful. Determination. And for the first time, the child was no longer asking to be seen. They were preparing to stand where no one could look away. The breaking point did not arrive with noise or warning. It arrived quietly, the way exhaustion does, after the body and mind have carried too much for too long. By then, the child had learned how to survive without help. They moved through each day with careful control, keeping emotions tucked away where no one could reach them. From the outside, they looked steady, responsible, fine. That word followed them everywhere. But inside, everything was strained. Years of silence had taken their toll. The child felt tired in a way that sleep could not fix. They were tired of proving themselves without being seen. Tired of working harder only to be overlooked. Tired of standing patiently while others were guided forward. The final moment came on an ordinary day. It was meant to be a public moment of recognition, something that acknowledged effort and growth. The child had done everything required. More than required. They had prepared carefully, double-checked their work, and stayed late when no one asked them to. For once, they allowed themselves a small amount of hope. When the results were announced, the child listened closely. Their name was not called. Instead, praise went to others. Some who had not worked nearly as hard, some who had been helped every step of the way. The child stood among them, invisible once again as attention and applause filled the room. This time, the silence was unbearable. The child felt heat rise in their chest, followed by a heavy pressure. Their hands shook slightly. Their breathing became shallow. It felt as though years of swallowed words were pressing against their throat, demanding release. But nothing came out. They walked away quietly just as they always had. No one stopped them. No one noticed. Later, alone in a familiar empty space, the child finally allowed themselves to feel everything at once. The disappointment, the anger, the sadness, the unfairness of it all crashed together. Tears came, hot and uncontrolled, not from weakness but from exhaustion. They thought about every moment they had stayed silent. Every time they had chosen patience over protest. Every hope they had lowered to survive. And for the first time, the child felt anger, not just toward the world but toward themselves. Why had they accepted this for so long? Why had they believed silence would protect them? The realization was painful. Being unseen had not kept them safe. It had erased them. The cost of invisibility was clear now. The child sat with that truth as the emotional storm passed. When the tears stopped, what remained was a deep, hollow quiet. Not numbness this time, but clarity. They understood something they had avoided for years. No one was going to rescue them. No one was going to suddenly notice. If they stayed silent, they would remain invisible. That understanding forced a choice. The child could continue shrinking, continuing to adapt to neglect until nothing remained. Or they could reclaim something they had never been given: agency. The thought was frightening. Change meant risk. It meant standing out. It meant possibly failing where others could see. But staying the same meant disappearing completely. Slowly the child stood up. Their body still felt heavy, but their mind was clear. The pain had not vanished, but it had transformed into something solid. Resolve. They did not plan revenge. They did not dream of confrontation. Their decision was quieter but stronger. They would stop apologizing for existing. They would stop waiting to be chosen. They would choose themselves. That night marked the end of something important. The end of patience without purpose. The end of silence born from fear. The child did not yet know how change would happen. They did not have a plan, only a direction. Forward. The breaking point did not destroy them. It awakened them. And from that moment on, the child was no longer willing to disappear. Change did not arrive with applause. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, the way dawn breaks when no one is watching. Time moved forward, and the child grew into adolescence, then into early adulthood. The small body that once tried to take up less space became steadier, stronger, shaped by years of endurance. Yet the habits of silence remained. The difference was that silence was no longer weakness. It was choice. The world that once ignored them continued to do so. Old teachers moved on. Classmates followed familiar paths. No one looked back to see who had changed. And that was fine. Reinvention did not need witnesses. The young person began rebuilding from the inside. They studied with purpose, not for praise but for mastery. Learning became a form of control in a life that had once felt powerless. Every book read, every skill practiced, every late night spent improving was a quiet refusal to disappear. They learned discipline before they learned confidence. While others chased recognition, the young person focused on progress. They listened carefully, observed deeply, and asked questions only when they mattered. Their mind, once crowded with doubt, began to sharpen. Patterns made sense. Possibilities expanded. Emotionally, the work was harder. The past did not fade just because the future looked brighter. Memories of neglect surfaced often, especially in moments of solitude. Sometimes loneliness returned, heavy and familiar. But now it no longer meant worthlessness. It meant focus. Solitude became a strange companion, painful but empowering. There were moments when anger tried to rise again. When the thought of being overlooked for so long felt unfair and sharp. But the young person resisted letting bitterness take control. Success fueled by resentment felt hollow. They wanted something deeper. Purpose. They wanted to become someone who could stand firmly, not someone shaped entirely by pain. As time passed, their efforts began to show results. In new environments, among people who had no history with the quiet child they once were, their presence started to matter. Not because they demanded attention but because their work spoke clearly. Respect replaced invisibility. The recognition was subtle at first. A nod of approval. A responsibility given. Trust earned slowly. Each small sign felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. The young person had to learn how to accept acknowledgement without shrinking away from it. Still, they never forgot where they came from. They noticed others who stood at the edges of rooms. Others who spoke softly and were overlooked. Something inside them responded with understanding, not pity. Yet growth remained largely unseen by the past. Back home, nothing had changed. The town still moved at the same pace. The same people held the same assumptions. To them, the quiet child was still quiet, still forgettable. The young person did not correct them. They continued building in silence, strengthening skills, confidence, and emotional awareness. They learned when to speak and when to listen. They learned that silence could hold power when chosen, not forced. Eventually, an opportunity arrived, one that required leaving. It wasn't dramatic. No farewell speeches were given. No one asked why they were going. The young person packed their things, feeling the weight of years lift with every step toward the door. Standing at the edge of the place that had shaped them, they paused. This town had taught them endurance. It had taught them pain. It had taught them what it felt like to be invisible. But it would not define their future. They left quietly, carrying no anger, no need for validation. Only determination and a growing sense of self-worth. Reinvention had begun long before anyone noticed. And it would continue, whether the world was watching or not. Success did not arrive all at once, and when it did not erase the past. The young person had built a life far from the quiet town that once overlooked them. In new places, among unfamiliar faces, they were respected for their work and trusted for their judgment. People listened when they spoke. Their presence carried weight now. What they said mattered. From the outside it looked like a victory. But the past does not disappear just because the future improves. In quiet moments, memories returned without warning. A classroom filled with noise where their voice had gone unheard. A teacher's distracted nod. A name missing from a list that should have included them. These moments resurfaced when they least expected it, sharp and clear as if time had not touched them. The old feelings followed. Not as strongly as before, but enough to remind them where they came from. A tightening in the chest. A familiar sense of being overlooked. Even surrounded by respect, part of them still carried the child who learned how to disappear. They tried to push those thoughts away, telling themselves they had moved on, that the past no longer mattered. But ignoring old wounds did not heal them. The question of return began to surface quietly. At first, it was only a thought, fleeting and easily dismissed. Why go back? There was nothing there for them anymore. The town had offered neglect, not support. Silence, not guidance. Yet the idea returned again and again. What would it feel like to stand in that place now? To see the people who had once overlooked them? To face the spaces where they had felt so small? The thought brought fear. Not fear of the people, but fear of reopening wounds they had worked so hard to manage. Facing the past meant risking pain. It meant acknowledging how deeply the neglect had shaped them. It meant admitting that success had not made them immune. They wrestled with the idea in private. Part of them wanted to leave the past untouched, locked away where it could not interfere with the present. Another part knew that avoiding it only gave it power. The past still lived inside them whether they returned or not. Late one evening, alone in a quiet room, they sat with their thoughts. The world outside was calm, but inside, emotions stirred. They realized something important. They were no longer the powerless child. They had grown. They had built strength, skill, and clarity. The past could no longer define them unless they allowed it to. Returning was not about proving anything. It was not about confrontation or revenge. It was about understanding. About closure. Still, the decision did not come easily. The weight of memory pressed down as they imagined walking familiar streets, seeing faces that once looked through them. Would they feel small again? Would the old silence return? The uncertainty lingered. But alongside it came a quiet confidence. The kind built through years of discipline and growth. The kind that does not need validation to exist. They understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was movement in spite of it. Slowly, deliberately, they made the decision. They would return. Not to relive the past, but to face it. Not to demand recognition, but to release what had been held inside for too long. The weight of the past was heavy, but it was no longer unbearable. For the first time, the choice belonged entirely to them. And that made all the difference. The return happened without ceremony. The road into the town looked smaller than it once had, narrower, quieter. Buildings that once felt overwhelming now seemed ordinary, worn by time. The person who returned was not the same child who had left, but the place did not know that yet. At first, no one recognized them. They walked familiar streets, their steps steady, their posture calm. People passed by with polite nods or distant glances, unaware of the history standing right in front of them. To them, this was just another visitor, another face with no story attached. The air felt heavy with memory. Every corner held echoes of the past. A school building where silence had once swallowed them whole. A park bench where they had sat alone while others laughed nearby. Each place stirred something inside, but it no longer hurt the way it used to. The memories were present, but they did not control them. Slowly, recognition began to spread. A former teacher paused too long, eyes narrowing with uncertainty. A peer stared, searching for familiarity. Confusion passed across faces as realization crept in. The quiet child they had overlooked had grown into someone they did not expect. Discomfort followed. Some smiled politely, unsure of what to say. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few showed signs of guilt, though they did not speak it aloud. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The person who returned did not rush to explain. They did not demand acknowledgement. They observed. Silence filled the spaces where conversation might have been forced. This time, silence was intentional, controlled. They attended a gathering where familiar faces gathered easily, laughter flowing as if nothing had changed. At first, the returned figure blended in quietly, just as they once had. But this time it was different. People noticed. They noticed the confidence that did not need approval. The calm presence that commanded attention without asking for it. The way others now listened when they spoke. Whispers followed. Questions formed but were not asked. Assumptions shifted. The past began to collide with the present, and it made people uncomfortable. Those who once held authority struggled the most. Teachers, leaders, adults who had assumed silence meant weakness now faced the truth of their mistake. They avoided direct confrontation, offering polite words instead of acknowledgement. The returned individual remained composed. There was no satisfaction in their discomfort. No pleasure in watching others squirm. The return was not about dominance. It was about presence. Simply standing there, whole, capable, and unbroken, was enough. As the days passed, the town adjusted to the change. Some tried to pretend nothing had happened. Others began to reflect quietly. A few felt something shift inside them, recognizing patterns they had never questioned before. The returned figure did not push for resolution. They allowed the weight of reality to settle naturally. The reckoning was not loud. It was emotional. And it was inevitable. As they stood once more in a place where they had once felt invisible, the person understood something deeply. They no longer needed recognition to exist. But others now needed to see what they had once ignored. The moment of truth was coming. Not through confrontation, but through understanding. The lesson was never meant to hurt. It unfolded quietly without raised voices or sharp accusations. The person who had once been invisible did not return with anger in their hands or demands in their voice. They returned with truth, steady, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. They took their place in rooms where they had once been overlooked. This time their presence carried weight. Not because they forced it, but because others felt it. Conversations slowed when they entered. People listened more closely. Attention followed naturally, the way it always does when something real stands before it. The lesson came through contrast. Those who had once mistaken silence for weakness now struggled to reconcile the past with the present. The quiet child had grown into someone capable, thoughtful, and strong. The truth sat uncomfortably between them. Nothing needed to be said out loud. Teachers remembered moments they had dismissed. Adults recalled how easily they had assumed everything was fine. Peers felt the weight of exclusion they had never questioned. Awareness spread quietly, working its way through old assumptions. Some responded with remorse. They avoided eye contact at first, then offered hesitant kindness. Their gestures were small but heavy with meaning. Others grew defensive, clinging to the idea that they had done nothing wrong. They justified silence as normal, neglect as unintentional. A few truly understood. They saw how easily someone could disappear when no one was paying attention. They recognized the cost of indifference. These were the ones who watched most carefully, learning something deeper than guilt. Throughout it all, the returned figure remained composed. They did not seek apologies. They did not ask for validation. The lesson was not about being praised at last. It was about acknowledgement. Being seen, not celebrated. They shared their knowledge, their experience, their presence. They contributed without bitterness. They spoke with clarity, never exaggerating, never accusing. Truth does not need to shout to be heard. Silence returned to rooms, but this time it carried meaning. People felt it settle over them, heavy and reflective. They were forced to sit with the understanding that neglect could wound just as deeply as cruelty. That overlooking someone could shape their entire life. The lesson was not delivered through words, but through existence. Standing whole in the same space where they had once been ignored, the person showed what had been missed. What had been lost. What could have been different. That truth was powerful. Some could not face it. They turned away, choosing comfort over reflection. Others accepted it, letting the awareness change how they saw the world. The person who taught the lesson did not linger. They understood that growth cannot be forced. Understanding cannot be demanded. It must be chosen. As they stepped away, a quiet stillness followed. It spoke louder than confrontation ever could. The lesson had been given, and it would remain long after they were gone. Section 8. Teaching the lesson. The lesson did not arrive with anger or accusation. It arrived through presence. The one who had once been invisible did not return to demand apologies or explain old wounds. They returned simply as they were now, whole, capable, and steady. In doing so, they revealed a truth no one could avoid. They began to take part in spaces where they had once been overlooked. Meetings, gatherings, shared work, places where their voice had once been lost. This time people noticed. Not because they asked to be noticed, but because their words carried clarity and weight. When they spoke, others paused. When they acted, outcomes changed. The contrast was undeniable. Those who had once dismissed the quiet child now struggled with the realization. Memories surfaced. Missed chances, ignored efforts, silence mistaken for lack of ability. The past pressed in on the present, and it made people uncomfortable. No one was accused. No blame was spoken aloud. Yet everyone felt it. Some responded with visible regret. Their expressions softened. Their tone shifted. They offered kindness where none had existed before, careful and unsure. Others reacted defensively, convincing themselves that they had done nothing wrong. They leaned on excuses, on the idea that no harm had been intended. A few, however, truly understood. They saw how easily neglect could hide in plain sight. How quiet children could disappear without anyone noticing. How much damage could be done without a single cruel word ever being spoken. The lesson took root in those moments of awareness. Throughout it all, the returned figure remained calm. They did not seek praise or recognition. They did not wait for acknowledgement. The lesson was not about validation. It was about truth. They offered guidance where once they had needed it. They listened when others spoke, especially those who were overlooked. Their actions reflected the care they had never received. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was different. It was thoughtful, heavy, honest. People were forced to sit with the realization that silence could wound. That indifference could shape a life just as deeply as cruelty. That what they failed to do mattered as much as what they did. The lesson was not loud. It was lived. Standing in the same place where they had once been ignored, the person showed what had been missed, not with bitterness but with dignity. Their presence alone asked a question no one could escape. What happens when we fail to see someone? Some answered that question with growth. Others turned away. The person understood both responses. Not everyone is ready to learn. As they stepped back, allowing the moment to settle, there was no need for final words. No closing statement. The silence spoke for itself. The lesson had been taught. And it would linger, quiet, uncomfortable, and lasting. After the lesson was given, the quiet finally arrived. Not the heavy silence of neglect. Not the empty quiet that once made the child feel invisible, but a different kind. A stillness that allowed reflection. The kind that settles after something important has been faced. The person who had once been overlooked stepped away from the town without looking back right away. The streets no longer pulled at them the way they once had. The memories were still there, but they felt distant now, like pages in a book that had already been read. For the first time, they asked themselves a difficult question. Was forgiveness necessary? They had carried the past for so long that it felt strange to imagine putting it down. The neglect, the silence, the years of feeling unseen, those experiences had shaped them. They had driven their growth, sharpened their awareness, and built their strength. Letting go felt almost like erasing a part of themselves. But holding on came with a cost. They realized that even after everything they had achieved, part of their energy was still tied to old wounds. Not in anger but in weight. The past still occupied space in their thoughts. Still influenced how they reacted, how they guarded themselves, how deeply they trusted. Forgiveness had always sounded like something given to others. Now it felt like something that might be given to themselves. They reflected on what the past had taken. Confidence. Safety. A sense of belonging. Those losses were real, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Some damage could not be undone. But the past had also given them something unexpected. Empathy. Awareness. Strength built without shortcuts. A deep understanding of what it feels like to be overlooked. These qualities had shaped who they were now. They did not excuse the neglect, but they explained the resilience that followed. The question shifted. Forgiveness, they realized, did not mean excusing what happened. It did not mean forgetting or pretending the pain had not mattered. It meant refusing to let the past continue to control the present. Freedom did not require reconciliation. It required release. They sat alone one evening, the kind of quiet that once felt dangerous now feeling calm. They thought of the people who had overlooked them, not with bitterness but with distance. Some had learned something. Others had not. That, too, was no longer their responsibility. For the first time, they allowed themselves to stop carrying explanations. They no longer needed to prove how much the neglect had hurt. They no longer needed acknowledgement to validate their experience. What happened was real, whether others accepted it or not. That understanding brought peace. Forgiveness came slowly, not as a grand decision, but as a series of small releases. Letting go of the need for apology. Letting go of the need to be understood by those who never tried to understand before. Some wounds remained. They always would. But they no longer defined identity. They no longer dictated direction. The person stood at a crossroads they had never imagined as a child. Behind them was a past shaped by silence. Ahead was a future shaped by choice. They chose freedom. Not freedom from memory, but freedom from its grip. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from being ruled by it. As they moved forward, there was no dramatic ending to the past. No final confrontation. No clear line drawn. Just a quiet sense of closure. And for the first time, the weight they had carried for so long began to lift. Not because the past had changed, but because they had. The choice had been made. And it belonged entirely to them. The future did not announce itself with certainty. It unfolded the way most meaningful things do, slowly through choices made each day. The person who had once been invisible carried their past with them, but it no longer weighed them down. It had become part of their understanding, not their identity. They moved forward with a calm confidence, shaped not by praise or recognition, but by clarity. They knew who they were now. They knew what mattered. And what mattered most was noticing. In new spaces, among new people, they paid attention to the quiet ones. The ones who lingered at the edge of conversations. The ones whose hands hovered halfway up before falling back to their sides. The ones who listened more than they spoke. They saw them because they had been them. When others rushed past these moments, the person slowed down. They asked questions others didn't think to ask. They listened without interrupting. They offered guidance without judgment. Small actions, repeated often, created something powerful. Visibility. They never made a show of it. There was no need. Being seen did not require an audience. It required intention. Over time, they watched change ripple outward. A hesitant voice grew steadier. A quiet presence became more confident. Someone who once shrank back began to step forward. These changes were subtle, but they mattered. They always had. The person understood something deeply now. Neglect doesn't always look like cruelty. Often it looks like absence, like forgetting to look closer, like assuming silence means strength. They refused to make that mistake again. The past had taught them empathy in a way no lesson ever could. It had shaped their patience, their awareness, their ability to sit with discomfort without turning away. They did not thank the pain, but they honored what they had learned from it. Sometimes they thought of the town they had left behind. They wondered if the lesson had lingered there. If someone had noticed a quiet child sooner than they once had. If someone had paused long enough to listen. They didn't need the answer. Legacy did not require proof. The true legacy lived in everyday moments. In how they treated others. In how they created space for voices that might otherwise fade into the background. In how they chose to see even when it was easier not to. The person also learned to see themselves differently. Where once they had questioned their worth, they now recognized their strength. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demands attention, but the steady kind. The kind built over time, through endurance and reflection. They allowed themselves moments of pride, not in what they had endured, but in what they had become. There were still days when old feelings surfaced. A moment of doubt. A memory that stirred sadness. Healing was not a straight line, and they no longer expected it to be. When those moments came, they met them with patience instead of fear. They had learned how to stay present. One evening, they found themselves watching a group of people gathered together. Among them was someone quiet, standing just slightly apart. The person noticed the familiar posture, the careful distance. Without hesitation, they moved closer. Not to rescue. Not to fix. Just to acknowledge. The moment was small. But it mattered. As time passed, the person's influence became something others felt rather than named. They were known as someone who listened. Someone fair. Someone who noticed effort, not just noise. Their presence made spaces feel safer, more open. They had become what they once needed. That realization was both heavy and healing. The story did not end with applause or recognition. There were no speeches, no awards for surviving neglect or breaking cycles. There was only the quiet knowledge that something had changed, for them and for others who crossed their path. And that was enough. On a quiet morning, the person stood by a window, sunlight spilling softly across the room. They watched the world move, people heading toward their days, each carrying their own unseen stories. Once they had been invisible among them. Now they stood firmly in themselves, aware and grounded. They understood that being seen was not about standing in the spotlight. It was about being understood, valued, and acknowledged, sometimes by others but always by oneself. The legacy they left behind was not written in words. It lived in moments of kindness, in attention given freely, in silence that listened instead of ignored. And somewhere not far away, a quiet child sat in a room full of noise, and this time someone noticed. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And it would continue quietly long after the story ended.